one of the most prominent Republican lawmakers, passed away last night at the age of 71. Initial findings show Graham died from an aorta rupture connected to hardening of the arteries.
For 30 years, he was one of the most powerful men in America. Millions of people knew his name. They knew his voice, his face, and the wars he fought on the world stage.
I don't know another person who spent his entire adult life for one purpose: to make sure America remained the safest country on the planet to live.
But almost nobody knew the truth about the place he called home, or the quiet darkness waiting for him inside its walls. What really happened in that house on his final night is far stranger and far sadder than anyone was ever told. And it changes everything you think you know. The last night in the house on the hill. Let's start with how strange and how sad this ending really was. And for this, you have to understand where Lindsey Graham was standing just one day before it happened. He was in Kiev. He was in the middle of an active war, in a country under attack, walking through a factory where they build the drones that shoot other drones out of the sky. He was holding one of those machines in his hands and smiling like a boy on Christmas morning. He looked at the cameras, and he said something that now feels almost unbearable to hear. He said that he had, never in his life felt more optimistic, that they had finally found the formula to end this war. That was Friday. That was a man with plans. He met the Ukrainian president twice that final week. He announced that he had just gotten the White House to agree to his Russia sanctions bill, the thing he had been chasing for months. Then he got on a plane and flew home to the country he served, back to that quiet little house near the Capitol dome, and he called Donald Trump to tell him the trip had gone well. Trump would later say that Graham sounded a little tired, but otherwise perfect, that he was always working, that he was a worker right up to the very end. Graham told him the flight had been long and that he was worn out. That was the last real conversation he ever had. A short phone call about work from a man who had no idea he had only a few hours left. At around 8:30 in the evening, a call went out to emergency services in Washington. Somebody was reporting a man with chest pains at Graham's address. Here is the detail that turns this from sad into something closer to cruel. The person who called it in was not even in the house. The person who called was all the way up in Baltimore, phoning for help for a friend they could not reach. They told the dispatcher the door would be unlocked. When the paramedics arrived and threw themselves against it, the door was deadbolted from the inside. They lost precious minutes at the threshold of his own home, standing outside while the clock ran down on the man they were trying to save. Roughly 25 minutes after that first call, the report came back that they were doing CPR. A neighbor saw an older man carried out on a stretcher into the night. It was already too late. His office released a statement that was heartbreaking in how little it said. They said that on the evening of Saturday, the 11th of July, United States Senator Lindsey Graham had passed away from a brief and sudden illness. They asked for prayers. They asked for privacy. There was no long goodbye, no months in a hospital, no chance for the country to prepare itself. One day, he was in a war zone full of hope, and the next, his family was asking the world to leave them alone in their grief. And the man who came from absolutely nothing, who clawed his way from the back of a pool hall all the way to the center of American power, died the way he had lived so much of his private life, which was without a wife, without children, and without anyone in the room. To really feel the weight of that empty house, you have to go back to the very first house he ever lived in, because it explains everything about the man who died alone in this one. The boy from the back of the bar. Lindsey Graham was born on the 9th of July in the year 1955 in a tiny mill town called Central, tucked into the hills of upstate South Carolina. His parents, Millie and Florence James Graham, ran a place called the Sanitary Cafe, which was a restaurant and a bar and a pool hall and a liquor store all crammed under one roof. For years of his childhood, his entire family lived in a single room behind that bar. One room. That was the bedroom and the kitchen, the living room and everything else, for all four of them. His younger sister once described it as a hole in the wall, where the couch and the television and the beds all lived together in the same cramped space. They bathed in a metal tub. They shared a bathroom with the mill workers who wandered in off their shifts. By the time he was 12 years old, Lindsey was already working. He racked the pool balls on the busy nights, and he watched grown men drink themselves into trouble. He answered the phone when angry wives called the bar looking for husbands who had disappeared into the bottom of a glass. This was his childhood. Not Little League and summer camp, but a smoky room full of adults and their problems, and a little boy learning far too early how the hard side of life actually works. He would later joke that if a parent raised a kid that way today, they would probably lose custody. But you can hear something underneath the joke. You can hear a man who never really got to be a child. He was not a brilliant student, and he never pretended to be. He made mostly C grades. He once wrote honestly that his test scores were poor, that he was nobody's idea of a genius on paper. But something in him refused to accept the size of the room he was born into. When he was just a freshman in high school, he stood up and told a class that one day he wanted to be governor of the whole state. The other kids laughed at him, a boy from behind a bar dreaming out loud like that. They thought it was funny. He became the first person in his entire family to however go to college, riding a Greyhound bus back and forth to see his people. And just when it looked like the poor kid with the impossible dream was actually going to make it out, life reached back and took almost everything from him. The year that broke him and built him. Imagine being 21 years old and getting the kind of phone call that splits your life into a before and an after. Graham's mother, Millie, got sick with a brutal cancer called Hodgkin's lymphoma. She died when she was only 52. Her funeral fell the day before his little sister's 12th birthday, which is the kind of timing that feels like the universe being needlessly cruel. And the family had barely begun to breathe again when it happened a second time. About 15 months later, while Lindsey was in his very first semester of law school, his father died of a sudden heart attack. Both parents gone in just over a year. He was 22 years old, and the world he knew had completely collapsed. Sitting in the wreckage of that was a 13-year-old girl, his sister, Darlene. And in that moment, Lindsey Graham made a decision that would quietly shape the rest of his days on this earth. He did not send her away. He did not let anyone else raise her. He stepped up and he became her legal guardian, a 22-year-old boy suddenly acting as a father and a mother and a brother all at the same time. Later, so that she could receive military benefits, he legally adopted his own little sister. Think about that. He adopted her. She has said since then that there was never any doubt in her mind, or anyone else's mind, that Lindsey was her parent. She has called him a brother and a father and a mother, all rolled into one person. The reason he never married may not be a mystery at all. He learned to be a caretaker before he ever learned to be a partner. He gave his young adulthood to raising a child, and by the time that job was done, the guardian role had become who he was. He looked after his sister, then he looked after his soldiers, then he looked after entire nations. And somewhere in all of that, looking after everyone else, the loud man from the little town never built the one thing waiting for most people at the end of the day, which is a family of his own inside the walls of his home. That instinct to protect and to serve did not stay small. It grew until it put him in a uniform and sent him halfway around the world. The man in uniform. Long before he was a household name, Lindsey Graham was a lawyer in an Air Force uniform. He joined up in the year 1982, working as a military attorney. first defending service members and later prosecuting them. They stationed him in Germany, and for 4 years he served as the Air Force's chief prosecutor across all of Europe. He even turned up on national television in the 1980s, on the famous program 60 Minutes, defending a pilot and exposing how badly the military's testing was actually being run. This was a man who took the law seriously and who was not afraid of a fight, even when the whole system was on the other side. He did not stop serving when he got elected. He kept his military career going for decades while he sat in Congress. He was recalled to active duty during the Gulf War in the early 1990s. He served short tours in Iraq in the year 2007, and he went to Afghanistan too. For years, he worked as a senior legal advisor dealing with the detention of prisoners in those war zones, and for that service, his country awarded him the Bronze Star. When President George W. Bush pinned the rank of colonel on him at the White House, it was not a favor for a friend. It was 30 years in the making. By the time he finally hung up the uniform in the year 2015, he had given more than 33 years of his life to the military. And here is a small detail that tells you something real about the man. All those years he served while in Congress, he never once took a military paycheck for it, because the law does not allow it. He was not doing it for the money. He was doing it because that boy from the back of the bar had turned his whole life into an act of service. That same fierce need to be in the fight was about to carry him into a completely different kind of war, one fought with votes and speeches instead of soldiers. The long climb to power. The kid they laughed at for wanting to be governor started his real climb in the year 1994. He ran for the House of Representatives in a district that had not sent a Republican to Washington since 1877, and he won it. He became part of a wave that changed the country. He won that seat again and again, sometimes by huge margins, sometimes without anyone even bothering to run against him. Then, in the year 2002, when the legendary South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond finally stepped aside, Graham stepped up and won the Senate seat. He became the first brand-new senator his state had elected in decades. In the year 2014, a whole movement rose up specifically to end his career, convinced he worked with Democrats too often. So he did what he always did when someone told him he could not win. He built a machine. He set up offices all over the state and gathered thousands of staffers and volunteers and more than 5,000 local captains. And when the votes came in, he did not just win. He crushed everyone in his path. Time and time again, the people who bet against Lindsey Graham lost their money. Back when Donald Trump first ran for president, Graham absolutely could not stand him. He called Trump a jackass in public. He called him a race-baiting bigot and told him to go straight to hell. Trump fired right back and read Graham's personal cell phone number out loud to a crowd of thousands so they could all harass him. These two men were open enemies. And yet, by the end, Lindsey Graham had become one of the most loyal and trusted allies Donald Trump ever had in Washington, a man who called himself the president's guiding star. How on earth two enemies became that close is a story about power and survival that says a lot about who Graham really was underneath it all. The enemy who became the best friend. The thaw started with a simple lunch in the spring of the year 2017, after Trump had already won the White House. The two men who had torn each other apart sat down together, and something shifted. Before long, they were out on the golf course together like old buddies. Graham handed the president his new phone number. The man who once said Trump would destroy the party ended up defending him through impeachment, backing him for re-election, and standing beside him at rally after rally. For a brief moment after the trouble at the Capitol in early 2021, Graham stood up and said, "Count me out. Enough is enough." But it did not last. The friendship held, and it held all the way to the end. To understand the pull of that friendship, you have to know about the other great friendship of his life, the one with Senator John McCain. McCain was his best friend in the whole Senate, a fellow warrior who traveled the world with him into danger zones for more than 20 years. When McCain died in the year 2018, a piece of Graham went with him. McCain's own daughter, Megan, wrote after Graham's death that there were almost no memories of her father's career that did not somehow include Lindsey. She described how her dad and Graham and a third senator called themselves a trio, and she said her father was the soul of the group while Lindsey was the fire and the humor. She wrote that she hoped Lindsey was up in heaven now, fishing with her dad again. That is the human being that gets lost behind the political headlines. Yes, he was a hawk who wanted America involved in every fight on the planet. Yes, he was Israel's fiercest defender, so much so that the Israeli Prime Minister called him one of the country's greatest friends, and said losing him felt like losing a beloved friend. Yes, he pushed for war and sanctions and strength around the globe. But the people who actually knew him did not talk about the policies when he died. They talked about the laugh. That warmth is exactly what makes where and how he died sit so heavy on the heart. The quiet house and the empty chair. So let us come back to that house on Capitol Hill, because now you can feel the full weight of it. It was a modest little brick townhouse, just 2 bedrooms, barely any bigger than the world he had climbed out of. This was not the mansion of a powerful man. It was a small, plain home for a man who was almost never actually in it, because he was always somewhere else, on a plane, in a war zone, on a stage, serving someone. His real home was back in Seneca, South Carolina, a peaceful place near the water and the Blue Ridge Mountains, a simple ranch house he had owned since the early 1990s. Even at the height of his power, this man lived small. He never chased yachts or private jets or the flashy life. He just worked. And that is the part that has broken so many hearts this week. His communications director, a man who stood beside him for 27 years, said it plainly. He said, "You had a guy who grew up in the back of a pool hall, a beer joint, a man who truly came from nothing. From that nothing, Lindsey Graham built a life that touched presidents and generals and the fate of entire countries. But when the final night came, all of that fell away. There was no wife to call the ambulance. There were no children in the house. There was a locked door and a phone call from a city an hour away, and a good man's heart giving out in a quiet room. The whole country mourned him within hours. Prayers went up in the churches of his home state, including the very church in Seneca, where he had once been baptized as a boy. He gave his whole self away to the world, one trip and one fight, and one cause at a time. And in the end, the guardian who watched over so many had absolutely no one watching over him. Now, please share your honest thoughts down in the comments and tell me whether you think a life like this was a triumph or a tragedy.